It's over. Ukraine can't take it anymore. It has become so absolutely obvious that Donald Trump said it. And even Volodymyr Zelensky had to admit it. In a sudden change of stance, which it seems, puts us all in terms of a now truly possible peace. The humiliation from that meeting has been absolutely historic. And after that historic dressing down of the West, well, of the United States to Volodymyr Zelensky, and perhaps also to the European Union, yes, there were a series of initial changes in stance that may still need to be finalized after that meeting between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Of course, we already know the players very well, so here, changes in stance don't necessarily have to mean much. Let's take a closer look at what happened in that meeting and what the symbolism was. This might be the most interesting part, and above all, whether we're talking about real peace or just an attempt. We no longer know if it's Western or Ukrainian trying to deceive. Yes, once again, the Russian Federation. Stay until the end, because I'm sure the conclusions will really surprise you. We start, as always, from the beginning. If we thought that what we analyzed in yesterday's video, among other things, that reception of Volodymyr Zelensky, which in itself already represented an absolute humiliation, when, instead of Donald Trump, or, I don't know, some more or less prominent figure from the United States, he was received by his own chief of the presidential office and the two pilots who brought him to the United States. Well, the thing had really just begun there, because what we've seen in the meeting between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky was basically one blow after another. There were symbols everywhere and messages to Volodymyr Zelensky, both direct and indirect. Quite a few glances between Donald Trump and his vice president, among many other things. Let's analyze this gradually and then move on to the second part. Will the change in stance that Zelensky had as a result of these multiple, clearly humiliating situations really end up being permanent? Let's start with the laughter, which, to be honest, I couldn't tell you if there was a lot or not. Within the Ukrainian delegation, Donald Trump was waiting for Volodymyr Zelensky, although it didn't really seem that way given the reception he received at the airport. But in any case, he dedicated some very nice words to him that, of course, had to do with his outfit. That suit looks so good on you, Vladimir. No wonder you don't take it off even between meetings. Come on, if I were you, I'd use it a lot. I'm telling you, even to sleep. And speaking of suits, and getting into the realm of symbolism, we have to especially highlight the suit of the Secretary of War, because recently the name of this department in the United States was changed. Pete Hegseth, who is also the head of the Pentagon, was wearing a tie with some extremely interesting colors. Well, it should be emphasized here that these are not only the colors of the Russian Federation, but also of the United States. But a rather curious choice for the meeting with Vladimir Zelensky, don't you think? Donald Trump, by the way, did he keep joking? Or maybe not so much, because the initiative he was talking about could actually end up being carried out in very serious terms. Either way, what would you think about creating a tunnel through the Bering Strait between Russia and the United States? Yes, right through the Alaska area. I don't know about you, but Vladimir Zelensky certainly didn't like the idea very much. But that's a fact. But even more curious, Donald Trump, well, it seems he knew about it.
Yes.
Vladimir, I already knew everything, including that you wouldn't like this. Why do you think I brought it up? And to top it off, the painting, because we're about to move on to more serious matters, but they're definitely not any less funny. We have this look, I would say, extremely symbolic, between Donald Trump and his vice president, J.D. Vance. Yes, the look in question happened precisely when Volodymyr Zelensky was about to talk about the drones that Ukraine was going to propose to the United States in exchange for the Tomahawks. Yes, just as you hear it, it turns out that the little Ukrainian dictator showed up to the meeting that was supposed to happen, and above all, was supposed to happen, of course, according to Donald Trump's administration, which is still the world's leading military power. He sat across from Donald and told him that they had everything, missiles and very good missiles. But Ukraine was advancing extremely quickly in terms of drones, so it could share its knowledge with its American friend. Let's go as if Uncle Sam, who I remind you provides all the intelligence data to Ukraine to carry out, among other things, attacks against the territory of the Russian Federation, was no longer aware of the Ukrainian plans. In terms of drones, I would even say that he has exact maps, instructions for use, assembly, and production. And if he doesn't have it yet, it would just take snapping his fingers to have it instantly. But that doesn't seem to be very clear to Zelensky. So, we've gone from the economy of, give me money, please, and the more, the better, to a barter economy. We have drones, you have missiles, so we're going to do some kind of exchange. And of course, the look that J.D. Banks gave Donald Trump. I'd also say vice versa. It says everything.
It's like the mini Coca-Colas.
But then could you authorize some kind of exchange?
Of course, we have a proposal. We have a real proposal. Our drones.
If you haven't noticed again, the look? Yes, something like that. I'm telling you, this blabbermouth really came here to sell us the so-called latest technology of those drones. Donald Trump replied with something like, yes. JD still hasn't realized that the technology in question is actually something we lent them. Or even better, knowing the situation at the front very well. That's why I'm in Donbass. And from here, I do my work as a war correspondent. The vast majority of Ukrainian drones are actually made in China. So, the conversation between Vance and Trump could very well have gone like this. Haven't you noticed how there's been a surge? Whether it's assembling or buying Chinese drones, and now this guy comes along offering us stuff from AliExpress, so that we'll hand over the tomahawks? Look, JD, I won't do the facepalm gesture, so it doesn't look too bad in the newspapers. But the thing is, it's actually a big deal, because now it turns out that Zelensky is coming to act as an intermediary and buy drones from China. Come on, please, seriously. I think the staging has been pretty clear, and from these waters, this mud, or rather, these results. So Donald Trump, right after leaving the meeting, which by the way, according to, we're going to see it, suddenly it was over. He abruptly posted this message on social media. The meeting with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was very interesting and friendly. But I told him, just as I previously urged President Putin, it's time to stop the killings and make a deal. Has enough blood been shed? It's time to stop defining borders. With the help of war and heroism, we have to stop where we are. Now that both sides declare themselves winners, history will judge. No more huge and unstable expenses. This war would never have started if I were president. Thousands of people are killed every week. Enough. Go back home to your families in peace. This message, in fact, Donald Trump himself repeated it over and over again, and it has been one of the most widely broadcast by Western media.
With President Zelensky, as you know, today we had a very good meeting, a very cordial meeting. In my opinion, they should stop the war immediately. You go to the battle line wherever, and if it's not too complicated, you'll never be able to solve it. You stop at the line on both sides. They should go home, go to their families, stop the killing, and that should be stopped right now on the battle line. I said it to President Zelensky. I said it to President Putin. Thank you very much.
Zelensky's reactions during the meeting. He must have obviously had a pretty hard time with all of this. Now, I imagine he tries to make it seem the opposite. Of course, they didn't take long to respond and surprise the whole world, although except for one detail. Be that as it may, the rhetoric now is quite surprising. Where we used to hear more, where we used to listen. Can we handle Russia? Of course. And we're going to end up winning this war. Now, Vladimir Zelensky admits that he is indeed fighting against a great country. And what a surprise it seems. He's talking about stopping the conflict by recognizing the front line just as it is. I quote again the most important part, which is precisely the one that, in fact, all the media are quoting now. Since the country is opposing us, I think it's important that we stop at the current front line and start negotiating. I think both countries should stop, and this is where we need to add the necessary caveat. Vladimir Zelensky. He appears to use similar language as Donald Trump. I mean, a supposedly definitive peace, but in reality, not so much. Because stopping at the current line of contact could actually mean some final and decisive negotiations. Or just a truce that allows Ukraine to rearm, regroup, and attack again, which, clearly, would be exactly the plan of the Western masters. Maybe not the United States, but definitely the United Kingdom. Also, there is another very serious pair of lies that Volodymyr Zelensky has told at this meeting, and we are going to proceed to debunk them next. But first, the Western media did not take long to react to this message. Not so much from Volodymyr Zelensky, but from Donald Trump. It seems like someone gave them the order. So, Axios writes that Trump told Zelensky that he still does not intend to supply Tomahawk missiles to Kyiv, let alone exchange them for Ukrainian drones. It seems it didn't work. And indeed, most of today's headlines are saying that there will be no Tomahawks for Ukraine. The meeting was difficult, even bad. No one shouted, but Trump was tough. During the meeting, Trump made several sharp statements. At times, the meeting was somewhat emotional, sources said. The meeting ended abruptly in 2.5 hours. "I think we're done. Let's see what happens next week," said Trump, referring to the planned negotiations between the United States and the Russian Federation. He emphasized that the current United States proposal for a diplomatic solution to the conflict is to end the war, freezing the front lines, a proposal that is difficult for Ukraine to accept. Axios writes this. CNN, citing sources, says the following. Trump and Zelensky did not agree on the future of the war in Ukraine. The conversation was tense, frank, and at times uncomfortable. In a direct and honest conversation, Trump made it clear to Zelensky that he would not receive long-range missiles. Trump has the impression that Ukraine is seeking escalation and prolongation of the conflict. He is concerned about possible losses during the harsh winter ahead. And of course, how could we talk about statements from Western media without quoting the main Ukrainian source, the Kyiv regime, and therefore, Volodymyr Zelensky? So, it seems he left the meeting extremely pleased and literally said the following. Trump and I agreed not to talk about the Tomahawks. The United States doesn't want an escalation. We trust the United States and Trump because he wants to put an end to this war. We decided that we would work more on weapons production. The United States and Ukraine, along with other countries, will work on the logistics of future supplies. In the meeting with Donald Trump, Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized another key issue, telling Trump that Ukraine was doing very well on the front. We are going to refute this right away, because it's one of the key points showing that Ukraine can't give any more. They have to acknowledge it so that this absolute massacre, which makes no sense, can stop. Especially for the Ukrainian side, because here it is well known and understood what the final outcome will be. Volodymyr Zelensky claims things are improving for Ukraine at the front. Impossible. Ukrainian sources deny this information. Zelensky orders Commander-in-Chief to Teresirsky to hold Pokrovsk. These 2 weeks are far from the appearance of a cauldron, and even further from the collapse of the defense. At any cost, by any means. In fact, there is now an operational encirclement of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Group in Pokrovsk, and in Mirnograd itself. There hasn't been any rotation in the cities themselves for a long time. The supply of provisions and ammunition has been cut off. The losses are enormous. The difference between the Pokrovsk funnel and the Bakhmut meat grinder is that now everyone's mouth has been shut. Because of this, it seems like the situation is under control, but in reality, it's on the verge of disaster. I'm not the one saying this. That's what Ukrainian sources are saying, and they're talking about these 2 weeks, which is basically how long it's believed that meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin will take. In other words, they must hold the front until then. Let the Ukrainians fall, whoever may fall, says. Pay attention. The president of Ukraine himself, because if not, the consequences of this could be absolutely terrible. The whole world, and first of all, Donald Trump, could finally become aware of just how absolutely catastrophic the situation is for Ukraine. The West, particularly the European Union, would no longer be able to manage this situation. Of course, this strategy has a cost. And again, I refer to the same source from Ukraine. Conclusion. Meanwhile, Zelensky is trying to delay the fall of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd by sending the best of his troops into the Pokrovsk bottleneck. In other directions, there is a complete disaster, threat of collapse of the defense of Kupiansk, Limansk-Siversk direction, the threat of collapse of the defense in the Dnepropetrovsk and Zaporozhye directions, south of Donetsk. The defense there has already fallen. The situation, in fact, has become so extremely critical that Westerners now have to talk about it in these very terms. Here is the Bild journalist, Julian Ryabki, who says, "There are no Tomahawks, no Taurus, no peacekeeping forces, no fuel collapse. The Russians have advanced 20 kilometers into the territory of the Dnepropetrovsk region and have reached the center of Pokrovsk." That wave of optimism from the last 4 months, which was felt both by the soldiers on the front and by myself, is slowly starting to fade away. Wow, it seems like little by little they're starting to realize the reality. Ukraine, surprisingly, can't stand against the Russian Federation. We said it over and over again from here. To realize that, all you had to do was look at a map. Yes, as simple as comparing the size of Ukraine to the size of the Russian Federation. The latter's victory was clearly obvious from the start of the special military operation. However, it seems that only now the West and Ukraine itself are realizing this. But the million-dollar question is whether this is really the case, or if it's just an attempt to effectively freeze the front line, to reach some kind of temporary truce and gain time for Ukrainian forces to regroup and for the West to supply more weapons, basically so the war can continue. Be that as it may, from Russia's perspective, it's absolutely clear. Vladimir Putin has already said it on more than one occasion. But in this case, the most recent statements we should definitely mention are those of Dmitry Medvedev. During a meeting with a whiny beggar, Trump said something obvious, but quite curious, that Russia and Ukraine recognize themselves as winners in the conflict. Yes, this often happens as a result of military clashes, but this is not our case. And it's not just that we need a victory with well-known conditions. It's an axiom. The fact is that the current Bandera gang will not be recognized as the winner at home under any circumstances. Her comrades understand this perfectly. He will not be forgiven for the loss of territories, not only by the naked Hojlanazis, but also by political competitors. Therefore, the end of the war is the death of the regime. So Trump's thesis doesn't work here. But the main peacemaker successfully played against the Tomahawks in his characteristic way, putting pressure on world public opinion, and he ended the game in the best traditions of sending nuclear submarines. Sorry, brother, I don't have enough myself. I have to admit that so far, Trump is strong enough in his position. This is not my war. The marshy bee is to blame for everything, referring, I imagine, to Great Britain. However, even the marshy one was against sending long-range weapons to the little flag people. But this, of course, is not the end of pumping Kiev with new weapons. The continuation goes on, and we have to be prepared for any development of events. This is what Dmitry Medvedev says And in a way, I think he is drawing a red line here. There are conditions that the Russian Federation simply will not accept. And this is where I go back to quoting yesterday's video, where we talked about the theory that there could be an agreement between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And in this sense, Ukraine's territorial concessions will have to be much greater, and in some cases even unconditional. In fact, there is already information indicating that Ukraine is indeed willing to negotiate over territory and hand over the territory of the Donetsk People's Republic to Russia. Now, would I tell you? It would be the most prized part of the crown of military gains for the Russian Federation, but with a very curious condition. The Kiev regime, it seems, still hasn't realized what Dmitry Medvedev has said and the general stance of the Russian Federation. There are several sources indicating that Ukraine wants to exchange the territory of the Donetsk region following the 2-to-1 formula, 2 kilometers from other regions that Russia currently controls, or rather, parts of which Russia currently controls, such as, for example, the Sumy region, Dnipropetrovsk, even the Zaporozhye region, 2 kilometers from there, in exchange for 1 kilometer that Ukraine would give to the Russian Federation from the Donetsk region. This would be a very clever way for the Kyiv regime to regain territory. But to what extent could Russia really accept these conditions? I would tell you that under no circumstances, but I would love to know your opinion as a war correspondent. And to finish, the conclusions of today's report. Would I tell you that? Precisely in the regions of Sumy and Dnipropetrovsk is where the greatest advances of the Russian Federation are taking place. At this very moment, and in fact, between the regions of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporozhye, the front is already practically breaking, and Ukraine's line of defense is about to fall. That's why, perhaps, the Kiev regime is now talking specifically about these regions in terms of trying to regain the lost territory. Will they succeed? Only time will tell. I'm Liu Sivaya, a geopolitical analyst and war correspondent, speaking directly from Donbass, right from the scene. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the latest geopolitical news, especially about the Ukrainian conflict, because things are getting more and more interesting every day. And what happens from now on will most likely be events that determine the end of the conflict. Thank you very much for being here. Until the next report.